Southern Fried True Crime covers cases that are not suitable for young listeners, and there may also be some explicit language used. Listener discretion is advised. For my 150th episode, I chose the ultimate Southern murderess. She's so Southern, she would practically be a cartoon if she hadn't wrought so much destruction and tragedy. Pat Taylor Allanson isn't usually called a serial killer, but that's just a technicality. She did kill people, but 2 of her murders were done by manipulation. A violent, horrific shootout between a father and son, and she orchestrated the whole thing. Pat's story is a Southern Gothic drama with 3 acts. A tale of old Southern families, of secrets long buried, of pride, of jealousy, of betrayal. Pat idolized Scarlett O'Hara. She sewed period costumes to dress like her, even marrying in her lacy hoop skirt. But Pat didn't just want to dress like Scarlett. She wanted her own terra, a plantation on sprawling acres. She also wanted money, and the respect and prestige of an old Southern family name. She didn't just want it, she thought she deserved it. And she was willing to do anything to fulfill her dream. Welcome to episode 150, Arsenic and Chantilly Lace. The story of Pat Taylor Allanson. Patricia Van Radcliffe Taylor was not beautiful, but men seldom realized it when caught by her charm as Tom Allanson was. To say Pat was beautiful is much like the Ted Bundy effect. With our 2022 eyes, it irritates the true crime community to no end that Bundy is always described as attractive. I always try to point out that you are looking through modern eyes. Our standards of attractiveness are very different. Also, you are discounting the charisma and charm he is also famous for. That's difficult to catch in photos. When you watch videos of him, you still might be skeptical, but that was after he was caught. He was a serial killer and his mask was slipping. But let's not forget all the groupies at his trial. Some people are just more compelling in person. When you meet them, they are disarming. They naturally draw you in. It's eye contact, mannerisms, and tone of voice. And we are all susceptible to it. It is often the special gift of a sociopath. Pat was born in 1937, and as a child, her family said little Patty was prettier than Shirley Temple. Her natural curls were softer and bouncier. Her green eyes sparkled. She had a delightful little laugh. She was the absolute center of attention in her family. Pat's mother spoiled her daughter, believing her Patty was special, and put her needs above any other family member her whole life. The result was that the adult Pat truly believed she was special. She was different. That she was better than everyone else, and that she deserved everything she wanted in life. Marguerite would eventually defend her daughter to the bitter end, even lying on the witness stand for her. But back to Pat's perceived beauty. When y'all look at photos of her, you won't see the pretty, coquettish vixen she was. Pat came of age in the 50s and 60s, so she always wore her hair in a teased, bouffant beehive. Not only was it the style of the time, it made the 5'2" Pat seem taller. Also in photos, you'll notice a pronounced overbite, which makes her look even more plain because she often smiled awkwardly. But every man who fell for her said her overbite was very sexy. Her lips, always slightly parted, made her look sensual. She was thin but curvy, with a figure everyone admired and a waist as small as Scarlett O'Hara's, even after she had her children. But that hairstyle will get you. She never grew it out long, like the style became in the late 60s and 70s. Pat was certainly no flower child. She was a proper lady. At least she thought so. She did love the more risque styles that came into fashion, though. Mini skirts that barely covered her panties, halter tops, and short shorts. She loved to shock people with her sexy outfits, but she never did give up that bouffant. Often wearing no bra, she proudly bounced around what God gave her, enjoying the stares she elicited. And yet somehow she also seemed demure. And Tom Allanson was smitten, entranced, besotted with Pat. But Tom was in the middle of a bitter divorce, and his parents had taken his soon-to-be ex-wife's side. He was beaten down by everyone but the Radcliffe family. Pat was also recently divorced, but her family would have never turned their back on her, and they felt great pity for Tom. So Tom was ripe for Pat, this lovely, refined Southern lady from a good family, who also awakened sexual feelings in him that he had never imagined. He had to have her, at all costs. Not only did she drive him to distraction, her family accepted him and welcomed him into their family with open arms. Tom needed love and acceptance desperately at this point in his life. He was emotionally bruised, vulnerable, and lonely, and an easy mark for someone as manipulative as Pat Radcliffe Taylor. Mary Linda Patricia Vann was born in Wilmington, North Carolina in August 1937. Ironically, the same year that Margaret Mitchell won the Pulitzer Prize for Gone with the Wind. Her mother, Marguerite, was only 15 years old when she gave birth. It's unclear who Pat's father truly was. Her birth certificate listed Robert Lee Vann, but Marguerite's family believed the father was a married man named Cam Pigeon. When Anne Rule was doing research for her book on this case, she could find no marriage records of Robert Vann and Marguerite Seiler. No one in the family said they met him. Well, no one who was willing to talk to Ms. Rule. 2 years after Pat's birth, 17-year-old Marguerite gave birth to a son named Kent. This time she made no pretense of a husband, and her mother had talked her into giving this baby up for adoption. But once she held her son, she refused. While the father's name was left blank on the birth certificate, people couldn't help but notice that Kent looked a lot like Cam Pigeon. For the first 5 years of her life, Patty was raised by her grandmother, Mama Seiler, a member of the prominent Siler City, North Carolina family. Marguerite felt she had no choice. It was so difficult for a woman to work in the late 30s. You must remember, this was the Depression years. So she let her mother take Patty while she toiled away waiting tables and doing other odd jobs, giving Mama Seiler money and saving for her own place. When Kent came along 2 years later, Mama Seiler took care of him too. But he was not like her precious baby girl Patty. And Patty detested her baby brother from the beginning for taking any attention away from her. It took several years for doctors to diagnose Kent, but he was legally deaf. Back then, kids were labeled with ugly names, like deaf and dumb, though he had no developmental issues. However, the years of degradation in schools and later feeling unwelcome at home would take a terrible toll on Kent. When Patty was 5 years old, Marguerite remarried. At least that's what the official story was. I hope you know I am not judging her. According to sympathetic family members, Marguerite was raised in a fire and brimstone, oppressively religious household, and that's why she ran off and got pregnant at 15, as the family put it. And we're talking 85 years ago. Records can get lost, so there's no proof that she was not married before. But in the Seiler family lore, there was no Robert Vann, only the married Cam Pigeon. But now she met a gentleman, retired Army Colonel Clifford Radcliffe, who was 6 years her senior. The colonel adored Marguerite, and he didn't care that she had 2 small children. He happily raised them as his own. Patty and Kent Vann took the name Radcliffe, keeping Vann as another middle name, When he was sent back for World War II, it was a hard time for Marguerite and her kids. Colonel Radcliffe was with Army intelligence, and when he came back from the war, he was an elite officer, transferred all over the place, and took his family with him, including Japan, where little Patty played tennis with the Crown Prince. The Radcliffes moved all over, spending a lot of time in Germany, but also in the States, eventually settling in Atlanta, Georgia. Marguerite was still a beautiful woman, with a figure much like Pat's would one day be. Colonel Radcliffe was proud to take her with him to army balls and other functions. She was also charming and an asset to his career. Patty was showered with gifts and affection. She was never disciplined. Marguerite would tell people she couldn't bring herself to scold or whip Patty. She was too pretty. Little Patty learned quickly from being spoiled. She knew how to manipulate anyone by acting sweet and helpless. Growing up in Atlanta definitely fed Pat's Scarlett O'Hara obsession. She loved romance novels and honed her image and accent as a proper Southern lady as she grew older. At 14 years old, Pat started dating a man named Gil Taylor, who was 4 years older than her and in the Army. They married in September 1952 after Pat became pregnant. Just like her mother had, Pat gave birth to a baby girl at the young age of 15. They named her Susan. Then 2 years later came her daughter Debbie, and a year later they had a son named Ronnie. Years later, Susan told American Justice that her mother was very insecure and went to great lengths for attention. The Taylors were living in Germany, where Gil was stationed, when Susan was walking home from school one day, and she saw her mother beating herself with pots and pans through the kitchen window. Susan was baffled, but said nothing later when her mother called the police and reported she was attacked. There was no evidence of rape, and no arrest was made. So from a young age, Susan knew something was off about her mother, but she loved her and didn't want to dwell on it. As an Army family, you would think they moved a lot to be with Gil. They did in the beginning, but Pat always chose to go back home to her parents. They often kicked teenaged Kent out of his bedroom and onto the couch. He didn't mind. He was a sweet kid and adored his nieces and nephew. But as he grew older, he felt very unwelcome in his own home. Pat made no bones about it, and Marguerite always took her side. The Colonel and Marguerite were now Papa and Boppo, as Pat's children had dubbed them. Pat also cruelly revealed to Kent that he was illegitimate, failing to disclose that she probably was too. Kent idolized his adopted father and was crushed. He was having trouble in romantic relationships too, and because of Pat, felt constantly alienated from his family. After a really hard breakup with his girlfriend in 1965, Kent was in a minor car accident, but when police arrived, he was dead, from a gunshot to the chest. Some said it could have been an accident from the gun being thrown around in the car during the wreck, but the autopsy showed the gun had been pressed tight to his chest. He died by suicide. Marguerite was inconsolable. Some say she never got over losing Kent. The grief stayed with her all of her life. So she focused even more on her precious Pat. 2 years later, Patty's daughter Debbie, at 15, was pregnant. Now 3 generations of Seiler women had babies at 15. Debbie married hastily and left home. Her older sister Susan was determined to not make the same mistake. Pat was apparently happy to have her daughter out of the house and made snide remarks about Susan as well. By now, she had pressured Gil into buying a gorgeous piece of land, which unfortunately had an old decrepit house. They would build the plantation of Pat's dreams, though. Gil had built up the stables first, including stadium seating and lighting. Pat insisted on all the best for the new house they built. While Gil was working 3 jobs and still couldn't make the mortgage, Pat pressured her parents to sell their lovely home and move in with them. The Radcliffes lived in a beautiful place in an upscale neighborhood, also owning their stables in Atlanta. Marguerite was a society wife, and she didn't want to move out to the boonies. Though Marguerite was very sad to leave her home, she could never say no to Pat. So they sold their place and moved into the crowded house on Tell Road that was still under construction. They eventually took over the mortgage completely and turned it into a nice horse farm, though the house was never as elegant as the one Marguerite had been forced to sell. The Tell Road farm would soon become their home, with Pat living with them. Because a year later, Susan turned 18, then she got married a month later to a man named Bill Alford. At the reception, in front of all the guests, Pat suddenly announced she was filing for divorce. No one was more shocked than Gil, her husband of 19 years. They had just posed happily for family wedding photos, and she had papers served right then and there, and he was banished from the reception. Pat ruined her daughter's wedding. Everything had to be about her. And then she became a grandmother 2 days later when Debbie gave birth to a baby girl named Dawn. But Pat didn't dote on her grandbaby. Instead, she updated her wardrobe, feeling young and sexy again, and began dating numerous men, including a married member of Governor Jimmy Carter's cabinet. But none were the right match. Around this time in 1972, Pat was thrown from a horse and trampled. She developed blood clots in her lungs and was critically ill. As she convalesced at home, Pat found that being frail and waited on really suited her. Long after she recovered, she was constantly reminding people of how a blood clot could move and kill her instantly. So she was always too frail to work, and she never had any job skills anyway, other than teaching riding lessons. Pat's ill health would also become a lifelong excuse for drama. She was always fainting at something or another. In 1973, still feeling the sting of being dropped by the married politician and still insisting she was too ill to work, 36-year-old Pat soon started flirting with a man who worked on her parents' farm, 30-year-old Tom Allanson. Seaborn Walter Tom Allanson was born in April of 1943. Tommy, as he was called, was the fourth Walter in the family, but a great disappointment to his own father, Walter O'Neill Allanson. Author Ann Rule learned that Walter and his wife Carolyn didn't want children. They had a great love affair, and evidently Tom ruined that. Walter had served in World War II and then attended law school right before he was drafted into the Korean War. He was bitter that his adult life didn't really begin until he was 30. It explains his tireless and ruthless ambition. He became a very well-respected attorney in East Point, Georgia, a small city southwest of Atlanta. Carolyn was a nurse for an East Point doctor. Walter worked all of the time, and in his off time he liked to fish. But fish alone. Tommy wasn't welcome. Tom later told American Justice, "I guess you could say I never could live up to his expectations. I really don't know what I was expected to do. I gave everything I could." As an adult, Tom was tall and strapping at 6'3" and 258 pounds. These attributes came in handy for his work as a blacksmith and farrier. Tom had one failed marriage while he was in college, which aggravated his father, but he didn't like the woman, so he didn't grumble about the divorce. Then Tom married a woman named Carolyn, just like his mom, so they became Big Carolyn and Little Carolyn. But Walter tended to call Little Carolyn Jr., as in Carolyn Jr. These people and their nicknames are confusing. It's also funny to me that Tom was also born with four names like Pat. Then both moved from the juvenile Tommy and Patty to Tom and Pat. Haley will love that I admit this, but I also have four legal names, though my last one came in marriage. I just refuse to drop my maiden name. She thinks it's hilariously Southern. Anyway, Tom and Little Carolyn had two children together, Russ and Sherry. But they were a mismatch from the start. When Tom filed for divorce, it was all-out war. Walter and Big Carolyn loved Tom's wife and their grandchildren, even though they had never taken an interest in their own son. That's not totally fair to Big Carolyn. She loved Tom, but always deferred to her husband and never took up for him. Little Carolyn bitterly fought the divorce, taking Tom for everything he had. And while Tom's father, Walter, had been able to look past his son's first divorce, things were completely different now. Tom had children. He had a family to take care of. He could not abandon them. Walter took little Carolyn's side, even testifying for her in court, which drove a further wedge between father and son. Then the Allansons cut Tom out of their will, officially disowning their only child. With nowhere to go, Tom started sleeping on the Radcliffe's den couch. Because despite what little Carolyn claimed, Tom gave her every penny he could for his children, and she still kept them from him. Working for the Radcliffes was where he met Pat Taylor. She would later claim they knew each other for 15 years, as he had long worked in her parents' stables. But Tom remembered the first time he met her in 1973. She was dressed in a short skirt and a halter top. And she wasn't just sexy, she was sweet to him, and so was her family. Still smarting from his own family problems, the Radcliffes were such a comfort. Pat was interested in Tom for lots of reasons. He was tall and handsome, a hard worker, and a total gentleman, and he desperately wanted to be loved, so he was very vulnerable and easy to manipulate. And that's not all. She thought he also came from a family with old money. Tom could be her Rhett Butler. Pat knew Tom was at odds with his family, but she thought they would eventually accept her. One day, out hunting together, they came across a property for sale in the tiny town of Zebulon in Pike County, about an hour from East Point and Atlanta. It was a red brick house with a wraparound porch on over 50 acres, with a 25-acre pecan grove and 27 more acres of orchards, including apples and pears. There was a rose garden and a pond and many other beautiful things on the farm. And most importantly, horse stables, so Pat could have her own horses there. She was determined to get that property. Tom worked, but he had no real money, and she did not work. Her parents loaned them the money for a down payment, and Tom's grandparents also loaned them money. Grandpa Walter, known by everyone as Pa, and Nona Allanson had been disappointed in their son for disowning Tom, and they were still close to him. The elder Allansons had money, but not very much. They also had a daughter named Jean Boggs that they weren't close to either. And naturally, Jean and her brother, the younger Walter, didn't get along. The Allansons were a strange family. But anyway, Pa and Nona were elderly, and Pa was having trouble maintaining their home and land. Nona had been paralyzed with a stroke, and he just wanted to take care of her. The plan was that if they loaned Pat and Tom the money, they would build them a small house on the property. That never did happen. But with the help from Pa and Nona and the Colonel and Marguerite, Pat and Tom bought their Tara. The Colonel and Marguerite had one stipulation for their loan. They had to name the farm Kentwood, after Pat's brother. She may have inwardly seethed at this, but she did not argue. Their Tara was called Kentwood Morgan Farm. Morgan was the horse breed the Radcliffes owned. And now they waited for Tom's wife to finally sign the divorce papers. When she did, Pat was so petty that she married Tom on the same day his divorce was final, May 9th, 1974. They got the good news as they were leaving for a horse show on Stone Mountain. Pat had sewn them Rhett and Scarlett costumes for the show, and now they had their wedding clothes. Organizers of the horse show threw the wedding together for the happy couple. According to the Atlanta Constitution, Pat wore a hoop skirt and carried a delicate fan. Tom was attired in a top hat and swallowtail coat. As a final touch to make the image perfect, Pat stuck a fake Rhett Butler mustache on Tom's upper lip. In the weeks following Pat and Tom's wedding, Tensions between Tom and his parents rose. The elder Allansons refused to include Pat in the family, which really got to her. She couldn't accept the fact that someone didn't absolutely adore her. It enraged her. And if she wanted to get her hands on the family's money, she needed them to accept her. She really didn't even know how bad it was. Walter Allanson called her a whore. He hated her and was outright rude to Marguerite, who made it her business to try and smooth things over. He said he had no son and certainly no daughter-in-law. Pat's daughter Susan told the Atlanta Constitution that Pat prodded Tom during those weeks to reconcile with his father. Pat said, quote, "She was on his back night and day. Tom tried to tell her that his father didn't want him over there, but she really thought he needed to go over there and tell his father a thing or two and get back in his good graces. But it wasn't working, so she changed tactics." On June 28, only 50 days after the Stone Mountain wedding, Pat told Tom that Walter had come to the Kentwood farm while she was mowing the lawn and exposed himself to her. She demanded he do something to protect her honor, and Tom would do anything for his fragile wife. At around 9:15 a.m. on the following day, June 29th, Walter and Carolyn Allanson were driving near their boathouse on Lake Lanier when 9 shots from a .22 caliber were fired into their car. Whoever shot them had cut tree limbs in a nearby area to hide themselves while shooting. It was an ambush. Luckily, neither Allanson was hit by the bullets. They just had a lot of cuts on their arms by flying glass. No one was held responsible for the ambush, though Tom was the prime suspect. Walter angrily insisted it was his son and publicly vowed that he would kill him if he saw him again. When authorities investigated, they found 2 witnesses who saw a truck matching Tom's near the ambush site before and after the shooting took place. The ambush made the news because Walter had recently been qualified for a seat on the Fulton County Civil Court bench. He was up against 3 other Democrats. However, Tom and Pat produced a receipt from a gas station over 2 hours from Lake Lanier, time-stamped for when the ambush occurred. The investigation remained open. Days before, Walter had reported guns stolen from his home, again accusing his son of the theft. When the police called Tom, he was puzzled. He had his own extensive gun collection at the house. They were welcome to come check it, and they did. Tom did not have his father's shotgun or any other of Walter's missing guns. On July 1st, Tom called Walter at work. After hanging up, Walter was visibly upset. He then purchased a rifle and borrowed a pistol. That same day, Tom and Pat went to the East Point Police Department and reported that Walter Allanson had exposed himself to Pat. They asked for him to be charged with public indecency and making threatening phone calls. Before leaving, Tom reportedly told the sheriff, "If this kind of stuff keeps up, I'm going to kill him." East Point police looked into the report, but found multiple witnesses who recalled seeing Walter in his law office the whole day, the day that Pat said he exposed himself to her. This family feud was escalating, with both Walter and Tom publicly threatening to kill each other. Tom and Pat were supposed to ride their horses in costumes for the 4th of July parade, but Tom was afraid his father would come shoot him as he rode in the parade. On the afternoon of July 3rd, Walter received a call at work from an unidentified woman. She informed him that Tom was heading over to his house at that very second, and he was looking for trouble. Walter immediately headed home. Once there, he found the power was out and the telephone line was cut. Big Carolyn was already home, having brought 4th of July stuff for her grandkids, and little Carolyn soon came in with Rusty and Sherry. It was still daylight, so they had not noticed the power or phone being out. When Walter got there, he searched the house for his son, but there was no sign of him. He called the police. After an officer showed up, Walter told him he knew his son had been in the house. But when the officer asked to search the basement, Walter said no. He had already cleared the house. There wasn't much the officer could do, so he took off, but not before Walter warned him that if his son came back, he would kill him. A few minutes after the officer left, little Carolyn saw Pat pull into the next-door driveway. It was Tom's maternal grandmother's house, Big Carolyn's mother. When Pat noticed that little Carolyn had seen her, she took off in her blue Jeep. Around 30 minutes later, just before 8 p.m., little Carolyn called the police to say that Carolyn had been shot and Walter was holding a burglar hostage in a cubbyhole in the basement. When authorities arrived at the Elder Allanson home in East Point, they found little Carolyn in the driveway, screaming hysterically. She said that at some point after the officer left, Walter went down the basement stairs with a pistol and flashlight in hand. He was going to confront Tom. Little Carolyn later testified about what happened next, quote, "Daddy hollered that he had him cornered in the cubbyhole. He hollered to Mom to bring a gun down." Walter also yelled at her to get the grandchildren out of the house. Big Carolyn obediently grabbed the new rifle and headed down the basement stairs. Little Carolyn heard Walter yell, "Junior, get the hell out of here." Remember, he called her Junior, not Tom. As she ran from the house, she heard 5 or 6 shots like a pop gun, then one final blast. When officers made their way into the basement, they found 2 bodies, Carolyn and Walter. There was no sign of Tom or any other intruder. After examining the crime scene, investigators believe Carolyn was standing on the 4th step when she was shot in the chest with a 20-gauge shotgun from around 10 feet away. She then fell backwards onto the steps where she died instantly. Walter had been shot in the face and stomach with a shotgun from around 15 feet away. The rifle Carolyn had carried down the stairs was found in the basement, as was the pistol Walter had taken. But the shotgun used to kill the Allansons wasn't there. It was in the front yard bushes. There were no fingerprints on any of the weapons. The whole town, and of course the police, knew that Tom and Walter were in a feud. Tom was immediately a suspect. 3 witnesses claimed to have seen Tom running near the Allanson place. One was a police officer a few blocks away who was about to chase after him when he got the call about a shooting. He didn't connect it to the man he saw running. The other 2 witnesses were the Allens' other next-door neighbors who knew Tom. Authorities sent out a nationwide bulletin with Tom's information on it. While some officers looked for Tom, others looked for Pat. They didn't have to go too far. She was found a few blocks away, sitting in her Jeep in a parking lot. When asked what she was doing there, Pat answered that she had been in the area for an afternoon doctor's appointment. Officers didn't believe her. It was now past 8 p.m., hours after her appointment, and she wasn't even parked at her doctor's office. She was halfway between the office and the Allanson home. Pat was taken in for questioning, where she elaborated on why she had been in the parking lot. Tom dropped her off at her afternoon appointment and then set off on foot to the bank, leaving the Jeep with her. But he had never come back. Pat said she waited for hours and became so nervous that she started to think he had been run over. So she got some change and started calling hospitals. She said she didn't know what to do after she found out he wasn't at any of the hospitals, so she just sat in the Jeep, waiting. When told why they were looking for her husband, Pat told officers she couldn't believe Tom had killed his parents. There was no way. She explained that Walter had come up to our house when I was cutting the grass and exposed himself. Then he called and told my mother to tell Tom he was going to kill him. She also said Tom might hurt someone if they were hurting him, in a roundabout way, hinting at self-defense. When investigators started asking Pat for more information about her doctor's appointment, she fainted. An ambulance was called, but they found nothing wrong with her. Meanwhile, outside the station, officers were looking for Tom. At around 1 a.m., they were notified that Tom was at his plantation in Zebulon. 2 hours later, Tom was arrested without incident. On the drive to the station, officers interrogated Tom. They remind him he was being arrested for the murder of his parents, and he responded, "That's about as ridiculous as it can be." Tom said he didn't kill his parents. He hadn't even been at their house. He was too scared to go there, he said, because the last time he had seen his father, Walter said he would kill him on sight. When asked why he went home while Pat stayed in East Point, Tom said that he and Pat had gotten into an argument and he had ended up hitchhiking home. When Tom arrived at the station, Pat saw her husband and told him, quote, "Tell me you didn't do what they said you did," as she choked back tears. Tom paused, then responded, "I didn't do it." Investigators did not believe Pat or Tom's stories, but they didn't have enough to hold Pat, so she was released. While Pat went back to the Zebulon plantation and Tom sat in jail, investigators continued looking into the murders of Walter and Carolyn. They never found enough evidence to charge Pat, so they went ahead with preparing the case against Tom for trial. In mid-October 1974, Tom's trial for the first-degree murder of his parents began. The prosecution told the jury that Tom was the only person who had a motive. He was upset that his parents had disowned him, and they hadn't accepted his new wife, Pat. The prosecution was allowed to introduce evidence of the June 29th late Lanier ambush on Walter and Carolyn. Of course, they said Tom was the person responsible. They also had little Carolyn, who had changed her story about what she heard in the Allansons' house that day. She now testified, quote, "I heard a male voice telling Mom to shut up. Mom went down and I heard her say, 'Tommy, Tommy, Tommy.'" She was lying. It doesn't mean Tom was innocent, but she did lie. Tom's defense was that he had nothing to do with his parents' murder. He wasn't even at the house. He was at his grandmother's house, which was next door to his parents' house. The defense was completely undermined by Pat, who sat at the defense table as if she was one of Tom's attorneys. Tom's attorney had tried to get Pat barred from the courtroom, but the judge refused the request. According to the Atlanta Constitution, Tom and Pat, quote, "often chatted head-to-head during the trial and embraced during recesses. They were allowed to eat lunch together at the defense table during the lunch break, which is highly unusual." Pat often made faces at the jury, overreacted, and even fainted often in the hallway. Leading up to the trial, Tom's attorneys had tried to get him to plead guilty to manslaughter. They believed it was self-defense, even though Tom wouldn't admit it. But Pat had been insistent that Tom not plead guilty to a lesser charge. She attended every meeting Tom had with his attorneys, and she also helped plan his defense. The whole time, Tom thought Pat was on his side. She'd been telling him to trust her. She was taking care of everything. He thought she was the only person he had in his corner. The defense told the jury that the case against Tom was purely circumstantial. There was no evidence he was ever in his parents' house. There were no fingerprints or hair on the murder weapons or in the basement, and no blood was found on Tom when he was arrested. The defense said, "This is nothing but supposition, innuendo, hypothesis, conjecture, and suspicion." And unfortunately, 3 eyewitnesses, all of whom picked Tom out of a lineup. Tom's key witness was an East Point liquor store employee who said Tom couldn't have been at his parents' house when they were killed because Tom had been 2 miles away in his store. At 7:48 p.m., Tom asked for change so he could make a long-distance call. The employee had remembered looking at his watch. But the prosecution creamed him on cross-examination. He had never given a written statement and had also accused Pat and the police of harassing him. Pat's mother, Marguerite, testified for the defense about a meeting she had with Walter on July 2nd. She said the first thing Walter described was his bullet-riddled car. She said, quote, "He said he knew Tom had done it. Then he said he thought it would be all over by the weekend. He will either be in jail or dead." Marguerite also testified that Pat called her on the night of the murders at around 7:25 p.m. to say that Tom had taken off on foot to go talk to his grandmother. You know, the one who lived next door to the Allansons. I do not understand at all why Marguerite was put on the stand. These statements only made Tom look more guilty. On October 18th, after deliberating for just over 2 hours, the jury found Tom guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Tom was sentenced to 2 concurrent life terms. As he was led out of the courtroom, Pat told her husband, "Tom, I love you." With her husband in jail for the murder of his parents, Pat became close to Tom's grandparents, Paul and Nona Allanson, who had not disowned Tom. Nona was wheelchair-bound, partially paralyzed from a series of strokes, and Paul lovingly took care of her himself. These were the grandparents who loaned Tom and Pat the money for Kentwood, though they never had moved onto the property as promised. Prior to Tom's trial, Paul and Nona's daughter Jean had been helping take care of them. But after the trial, that relationship became even more strained because they never wavered in their support of Tom. They could not believe he would kill his own parents. So now, Pat started taking care of them. During this time, she had moved back in with her parents at the Tell Road farm while her son Ronnie stayed at Kentwood looking after the livestock. That November, a fire struck the farm at Tell Road, burning down the barn and stables. Colonel Radcliffe, at a dead run, managed to save the horses. A week later, the barn at Kentwood burned down, but luckily there had only been 1 cow and she was out to pasture. Then, the week before Christmas, the house on Kentwood Farms burned down. And yes, Pat cashed a $5,000 insurance check, which should not have gone to her. It should have gone to the mortgage holder, so the money never hit her account before it was caught. If there was any whiff of suspicion about these fires, it's not mentioned anywhere. Pat continued to suffer ailment after ailment. One was most bizarre. She developed an abscess on her right butt cheek. It continued to grow and become more inflamed, despite several lancings and rounds of antibiotics. Doctors were baffled. It was so painful she often used a wheelchair, particularly when she visited her husband in jail. Then she got really sick. She needed surgery to remove the abscess that was now protruding almost 4 inches from her butt, and she had developed a blood infection. She was hospitalized for weeks recovering from sepsis. But she was soon up and around again caring for Paul and Nona, and she never failed to visit her husband. She drove his jailers crazy, and she prevented him from being moved to a prison a few hours away where he could learn a trade and have a better life on the inside. Pat also tape-recorded phone calls and visits she had with Tom. Later, she mistakenly gave the tapes to her daughter Susan. They were mixed in with some music tapes. According to Ann Rule, quote, Susan thought they were all country and western tapes, but they weren't. They were very revealing. The woman's demeanor changed with every phone call. One tape had a conversation between Pat and Tom when he was in prison. She had brought poison with her to slip to him and asked Tom to take it. Pat told him, quote, "The only way we can be together is if we're both dead. You take it and I'll go out in the parking lot and take it, and we'll meet on the other side." Ann Rule told the Atlanta Constitution, quote, "The most chilling tape was the one in which Tom says, 'I love you more than anything else in the world, Suge,' and she says, 'Not quite. You love me more than anyone in the world, but you don't love me more than anything in the world. You love your life more than you love me.'" It would be many years before Tom admitted to the suicide pact that his wife had tried to talk him into. I think we know that Pat had no plans to kill herself, but Tom dying in prison would help her. In early 1976, Paul suffered a heart attack and was no longer able to care for Nona like he used to. Now, they needed Pat more than ever. For the first time in her adult life, she made dinners. Pat had famously never cooked, preferring to eat a tomato sandwich for dinner unless Bobo cooked for her. And now that Pat was completely taking care of Pa and Nona, she slowly started talking them into giving her a general power of attorney. Then she helped them make changes to their wills. They cut their daughter Jean Boggs completely out of the will and left their entire estate to Tom. With every change, Pat became more and more powerful within the estate, which was estimated to be between $120,000 to $200,000. Today, that would be between $600,000 and $1 million. Definitely enough to fulfill Pat's dream of being Scarlett O'Hara. The fourth and last revision to the will was written February 4th, 1976. That's when Pa and Nona named Tom as executor and Pat as co-executor of their estate. Because she also had power of attorney, Pat was allowed to use money in the estate before the Allansons died. It's most likely that Pa and Nona had no idea that because Tom was in prison, he could not control the estate, which meant Pat had full control over the whole thing. The Allansons' attorneys later testified that at the time of the changes, they thought the elderly couple was able to understand the changes to the will, so that's why they made them. If they had known the truth, they would not have done it. But that's not all Pat did. In April 1976, she took Pa to a bank so they could have some documents notarized. The teller, who was the notary, later testified the documents were laid in a pile. Pat flipped through the bottom edges so Pa could sign them. The teller said she didn't read the documents. Some notary. If she had, she would have noticed that one of the documents was blank. After the blank page was notarized, Pat typed out a 5-page letter where Pa Allanson confessed to killing Walter and Carolyn. He said his grandson Tom was innocent. The letter detailed how Tom had been in the basement when the shots were fired, but he hadn't been hurt. Pat put the confession in a sealed envelope and gave it to the attorneys who drew up the elder Allansons' wills. The envelope had a handwritten note on the outside that read, "Do not open until I pass out." The attorneys wouldn't open the envelope for months. On June 13th, Pat called the family doctor to say she couldn't wake 79-year-old Pa. The doctor went to the Allanson home and found Pa in a comatose condition. When asked what happened, Pat said he had been drinking whiskey before he took a handful of pills. She also claimed she caught him trying to smother Nona and had saved her. When Jean Boggs found out about this, she flatly stated it was a lie. Everyone knew that Pa doted on Nona. He had lovingly cared for her, bathing her, feeding her every day for years. Pat handed the doctor an empty bottle with the label removed, stating it had once contained the whiskey Pa overconsumed. Pa was admitted to the hospital, where he stayed in a coma for a week. When Pa's attorneys found out he was unconscious in the hospital, they opened up the sealed envelope and found the confession. But they didn't give it to the authorities. At first, Pa was treated for an overdose, but his daughter Jean refused to believe that's what was making her dad sick. Her father did not drink whiskey, she said, and very reluctantly took medicine. She had the hospital test him for poisoning. 15 days later, tests showed a near lethal level of arsenic in Pa. They had used Pa's hair and fingernails, which showed the poisoning had been going on for quite some time. Jean was terrified her 73-year-old mother, Nona, had also been poisoned. Though partially paralyzed, Nona had always been awake and cognizant. Now, Nona was constantly sleeping, barely lucid when Jean visited, and Jean had to practically force her way in with Pat trying to keep her out. Jean talked to Pa's doctors, who agreed to hospitalize Nona. She rushed to her parents' home, waiting for the ambulance to pick her mother up on June 28th. Pat had tried everything to stop this. Jean stayed right beside her mother, waiting for the ambulance to arrive, refusing to allow Pat near her. After Nona was tested and found to have dangerously high levels of arsenic in her body, Jean called the prosecutor who had prosecuted Tom for the double murder of his parents. Investigators tested the empty whiskey bottle Pat had given the doctor and found residue of a high concentration of arsenic, but there was no residue of whiskey. Now that they knew poison was involved, Paul's attorneys handed the confession letter over to the authorities. They didn't believe the contents of the letter, but it was a great piece of evidence, especially since the author had made a massive mistake when forging it. The notary seal on the confession was dated April 16th, while the typewritten date on the actual confession was for April 19th. When they asked Pat about the letter, she said Pa had dictated it to her as she typed it out. She couldn't explain why it was notarized prior to being written. After Pa's health improved, investigators spoke with him about the letter. He verified that it was a forgery. Pa had not killed his son and daughter-in-law and was horrified by the forged letter. The DA's office then had Pa sign an affidavit claiming the letter was procured through deceitful and fraudulent means. He also wrote out a formal statement, which an assistant DA summarized as, "The old man did not kill anyone and wasn't there." On August 6, 1976, Pat Allanson was arrested and charged with 2 counts of attempted murder. Less than a year later, on May 2, 1977, Pat Taylor Allanson's trial began. The prosecution's case was entirely circumstantial, so they sought to prove 3 things: access to the grandparents, ability to poison them, and motive for doing so. They said Pat slowly poisoned Pa and Nona, while taking over control of their finances and drafting the confession letter. Once everything was in place, she poisoned Pa for the final time, hoping he would die. With Pa dead, his attorneys would hand over the confession letter, Tom would be freed, and they would be $200,000 richer. The prosecution was allowed to enter Pa's forged confession for the murders of Walter and Carolyn as evidence. Pa, who was now bound to a wheelchair, testified that he did not write that letter. The defense told the jury they don't know how Pa and Nona got poisoned. What they do know is that Pat wasn't involved. Instead of Pat, it could have been a pure and simple accident, they said. Farmers keep arsenic for heartworms and livestock. Pa, a part-time farmer, may have had some around the house. It would have been easy for Pa to accidentally poison himself and Nona. After all, he was losing his mind from all the drinking and pill-taking, the defense said. Prior to going into a coma, they claimed Pa had even tried to smother his wife to death, despite Pa's vigorous denial when he testified. The defense offered another theory. It could have been Pa and Nona's daughter Jean, the one who had been taking care of them before Pat took over. She had probably gone to the DA's office to throw suspicion off of herself. The defense poked holes in the prosecution's case by telling the jury that Pat didn't need Pa and Nona to die to get their money. She already had access to it as power of attorney. They also questioned why Pat would hand over the arsenic-laced whiskey bottle if she had poisoned them. That would be handing over the murder weapon. Pat took the stand and denied knowing anything about arsenic. She testified that Pa confessed to killing his son and daughter-in-law. He had blurted it out to her when he thought he was going to die from heart failure. Pa then dictated the confession to her. Pat said Pa drank the whiskey and took the pills to take his own life. The guilt of killing Walter and Carolyn was too much to bear. The prosecution countered Pat's testimony by telling the jury that arsenic poisoning is a very slow and terribly painful way to die. It's highly unlikely someone would take their own life that way. They also pointed out that it takes a very cold-hearted person to watch their poisoning victims suffer for months on end. And Pat did not fare well under cross-examination. On May 6th, after deliberating for 8 hours, the jury found Pat guilty of 2 counts of attempted murder. 10 days later, she was sentenced to 2 consecutive 10-year prison terms, which was the maximum sentence allowed. Within the first year of her time in prison, Tom divorced Pat and she went back to her first husband's name, Taylor. Pat appealed her convictions and sentences. In January 1978, her appeals were denied. A year and a half later, Pat filed a motion for a new trial based on newly discovered evidence. The evidence was that Pat was insane at the time of her trial. With the motion, Pat included an affidavit from her trial attorney who stated he wasn't, quote, aware she was suffering from a mental defect, nor could he have discovered it by the exercise of ordinary diligence. According to an appeal document, at a hearing on the insanity plea, Pat's mother stated she believed her daughter had mental problems, including a suicide attempt, but insisted she had not told Pat's lawyers because she wasn't familiar with legal procedures. She also revealed something disturbing that explained Pat's brush with death from sepsis. That boil on Pat's butt, the inflamed abscess she had had for months that eventually required surgery, she saw Pat picking at the abscess with different things like long tweezers and cuticle scissors to make it worse. As Pat would have been twisted around to see what she was doing in the mirror, she never saw her mother watching her, horrified. Boppo had never told anyone before, and she only betrayed Pat now to try and save her from prison. Anyone who would do that to themselves had to be insane. She also admitted that her daughter took pills. She was addicted to Demerol and other pills Marguerite had seen. That was a secret of Pat's that had long been covered up. But despite Marguerite's impassioned testimony, the court denied Pat's motion in March 1981. One of the reasons cited was Pat's own lengthy testimony in her own defense. She seemed perfectly sane during her trial. It was official. Pat would have to serve her sentence. Anne Rule guessed that Pat may have had Munchausen syndrome, not merely hypochondria. She enjoyed the attention of always being sick. According to the Atlanta Constitution, Pat was, quote, a model prisoner at the Georgia Women's Correctional Institute at Hardwick, cheerful, friendly, and endearing to the prison matrons. And it was because of this behavior that led the prison to train Pat to take care of elderly people. In November 1984, after serving less than half her sentence, Pat was released from a halfway house and was paroled. After moving back in with her parents yet again at the age of 47, it didn't take long before she was back in front of a judge, accused yet again of poisoning an elderly person. When Pat went to live with Boppo and Papa after prison, they gave her the upstairs bedroom where she had her own private bathroom and an adjacent room for her doll collection. She now made dolls and sold them at swap meets and flea markets. She sewed tiny costumes and glued on hair. If you opened the closet in that room, you found a bunch of dismembered doll parts. It was creepy. During this time, Boppo took in her great-granddaughter Ashlyn to help raise. She was Ronnie's daughter, Pat's granddaughter. But Pat seethed with jealousy. And for the first time, Boppo told her no, Ashlyn was staying. She doted on the pretty little girl, just like she used to dote on her little Patty. Pat actively disliked all of her grandchildren except Susan's daughter, Courtney. She made Courtney an ornate dollhouse that was an exact replica of Tara. Susan's other child, her firstborn Sean, hated Pat back and couldn't stand when she visited. Susan had a pregnancy in her 30s and gave birth to a little boy named Adam. Pat insisted on coming to help Susan with the new baby. She practically moved in. Soon, Susan felt sick all the time. Her doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. Susan's husband Bill had put up with so much shit about Pat over the years, and now he and Sean suspected she was making Susan sick. But Susan wouldn't listen to them. Susan and her husband fell on hard times financially, so naturally, Pat stopped visiting, and miraculously, Susan got better. Unfortunately, her marriage did not survive. And even worse, Sean became estranged. He moved in with his girlfriend's family and refused to have anything to do with his mother or her crazy family. Susan, now broke and a single mother, finally moved away. Courtney, now a teenager, sold her dollhouse at a yard sale, and gave the money to her mother. They all started a new life, and Susan did eventually remarry. But before all that happened, in the spring of 1987, Pat forged a resume in order to take a job as an in-home registered nurse for a prominent Atlanta couple, James and Betty Christ. Married since 1933, James was an executive in the electric power industry, while Betty was an honors college graduate who spent most of her time as a member and volunteer of many organizations. They were extremely wealthy and an extremely loving couple. Pat said she had been certified during her time in the Army and gave her supposed certification number from the Army instead of a nursing license. The Christs thought Pat was a very nice lady and never followed up on that registered nurse issue. Not long after Pat started working for the Christs, she brought her daughter Debbie on as a fellow fake registered nurse in order to help with James, whose health was deteriorating due to Parkinson's disease. He sadly passed away in December 1988. Pat and Debbie continued caring for Betty in her home until early 1989 when they were let go. They told family and friends that they had been let go because Betty's insurance had run out. Pat's other daughter Susan believed that story until one night in 1990 when Debbie called Susan and said, "You ruined it for us. We know that you called Mrs. Christ and told her lies about us. You made us lose our jobs, and I'll never forgive you." Susan later told the Atlanta Constitution that she was puzzled over this call. She had no idea what her sister was talking about. But knowing her mother, she knew it couldn't be anything good. Susan told her husband Bill about the call, and he told her he had had it. He called Betty Christ himself. That's when Susan and Bill got the shock of their lives. Betty told them the real reason Pat and Debbie had been fired. Not long after Pat and Debbie started posing as registered nurses and working for the Christs, they took control of the household and pretty much ran it. Pat acted as head nurse and fired many of the weekend nurses or blamed them for missing items in the house. Anne Rule wrote that Pat then followed the same pattern she used with the Allansons. She separated James from Betty and also managed to keep their kids from visiting much, always saying that they were sleeping and were not to be disturbed. Pat had drugged Betty with enough sleeping pills to make her almost comatose. It is unclear if she drugged James. By the time anyone figured out what Pat was doing, he had been cremated. And while arsenic is one of the few drugs that can be detected in cremains, the Christs understandably did not want to disturb his resting place. They had just wanted to move on with their lives before they found out about Pat's attempted murder convictions. Now, they wanted her and Debbie prosecuted, but they still did not want to disturb their father's cremains when it was possible there would be no arsenic found. Pat had probably used sleeping pills on him as well, which would not be detected. With the wealthy couple sleeping most of the time, Pat and Debbie started stealing a large amount of jewelry, including a Rolex watch, priceless Civil War artifacts, and other antiques. She didn't sell the items either, well, at least not all of them. According to Susan, quote, she had the most beautiful antique lace that was missing from the Christs that she used to make outfits for her dolls. According to Anne Rule, Pat had also given Susan a pearl necklace and an antique cookbook, which were some of the only items the Christs were able to recover. And Debbie did pawn that Rolex, which was eventually traced back to her. Pat and Debbie had also tried to get Betty to include them in her will. In early 1989, a few months after James's death, the Christ's son Jim was worried about his mother's declining health, so he stopped in for a surprise visit. Pat was serving his mother lunch. That's when he saw pills in Betty's salad. Suspicious, Jim secretly took Betty in for a blood test. He told Pat they were going for a ride. It was a good thing he did, because test results showed that Betty had been loaded with the sleeping pill Halcyon. Jim fired both Pat and Debbie and then went to the police. They opened a case, but there wasn't much to go on. According to the chief investigator, quote, The entire file consisted of a yellow sheet from a legal tablet that read, "All leads exhausted." Susan couldn't let her mom and sister get away with this, so she called the DA's office. With the new information from Susan, they assigned the Christ case to the DA's investigator, Don Stoop. Stoop and his partner Michelle Berry did a deep dive on the Christ case, as well as the Elder Allanson murder case. By the time they were done, they were convinced Pat was also involved in Walter and Carolyn Allanson's murders. On April 17, 1991, Pat and Debbie were arrested and charged with aggravated assault with intent to murder, 2 counts of theft, 2 counts of unlawful acquisition of drugs, and practicing nursing without a license. Pat, Debbie, and the rest of the family were incredibly angry at Susan. They felt it was her fault the women had been arrested. With Pat behind bars again, Stoop and Berry pushed for her to face charges for the murders of Walter and Carolyn Allanson. But Fulton County Assistant DA Bill Atkins decided to play it safe and offer Pat a plea deal, which would include her pleading guilty to all charges involving the Christs. In exchange, she would receive an 8-year sentence. Debbie would be placed in a pretrial intervention program instead of prison, and most appealing, the DA's office would never again question her about the Allanson murders. Assistant DA Atkins told the Atlanta Constitution, quote, "When you start getting a case that old, your proof problems multiply. It was certainly something we could have indicted on, but frankly, it was more of a bargaining tool." Stoop and Berry were livid. The DA was letting Pat get away with murder. Double murder. On June 12, 1991, Pat took an Alford plea, conceding to all the charges, and was sentenced to 8 years. Keeping Debbie out of prison as part of her plea deal was probably the most selfless thing Pat had ever done for her children. With Pat now having multiple attempted murder convictions, authorities decided to talk to Tom. He had been paroled in 1989. For the first time, Tom Allanson told the truth about what happened to his parents on the night of July 3, 1974. He had shot and killed them. But it was in self-defense, as his attorney had suspected. Tom said he had gone to his parents' house that day to talk to his mom and see if they could reconcile. He knew his dad wasn't supposed to be home for hours. No one was home, so Tom hid in the basement to wait, just in case his dad came home early. Tom was being extra careful because the last time he saw his father, Walter said he would kill him, and Tom believed it. As he hid in the basement, Walter, Carolyn, little Carolyn, and the 2 children showed up after being alerted by an anonymous woman that Tom was on his way over. Walter went downstairs with a pistol to look for Tom. After he found Tom hiding near the cubbyhole, he started shooting around the wall, emptying the pistol. Tom backed into the cubbyhole and realized his father had hidden a shotgun in there, the one he had reported stolen. Tom grabbed that shotgun while Walter yelled up the stairs to Carolyn to bring his new rifle. He yelled, "I've got him cornered." He never said Tom's name. Carolyn brought it downstairs, and as she was near the bottom, she fired at Tom. At the same time, Tom fired back without realizing it. She was dead instantly, literally just sitting down on one of the stairs. She certainly never yelled, "Tommy, Tommy," because she had fired blindly. Again, little Carolyn did lie in court. I mean, Tom did it, but it wasn't necessary to lie. She did it for revenge. When Carolyn sat down heavily, dead, Walter picked up the rifle Carolyn had been carrying. As Tom tried to run away, Walter aimed the rifle at him. Tom then fired his shotgun again as he ran. Once he was upstairs and out of the house, he ditched the shotgun in the bushes. He told investigators he now realized Pat had manipulated the situation. She had repeatedly nagged him into going over to visit his parents. She lied to him about Walter exposing himself. She had made that anonymous call to Walter to warn him that Tom was headed over. She was responsible for everything but pulling the trigger. Think about it. She had most likely snuck in the house and hid that shotgun in the cubbyhole. She had cut the telephone line and shut the power breaker off. Her car was literally seen next door. You may be thinking that Tom's story is absolutely crazy, but there's evidence to back it up, at least the parts about the actual shooting. Tom had said his father shot at him 6 times with a pistol. There were 6 bullet holes in the walls surrounding the cubbyhole, and there were only 6 casings from the pistol found. Tom said his mother had fired the rifle once, and he had fired the shotgun twice. The evidence also confirmed that. Authorities ended up believing Tom's story. They had always thought Pat had played a role, but until this point, it was unclear what she had done. Now, it was obvious she had manipulated the whole situation. It just didn't end up exactly the way she had hoped. Ann Rule had a theory on why Pat set up the murder of Walter and Carolyn. Pat thought there would be, quote, an explosion of gunfire in the basement, and Tom would also be killed. She never expected him to walk out of that basement alive, and she was under the mistaken impression that he would still inherit his parents' money as their only child, and then the money would go to her as his surviving wife. Tom had tried to explain to her numerous times what it meant to be disowned, but she either didn't listen or thought she would somehow get around it if they were all dead. Well, Walter left his entire estate to his parents, Pa and Nona. And that's why Pat all of a sudden decided to care so lovingly for Tom's grandparents. She now needed them dead. Tom was the executor of their estate, and with him in prison, that role would fall to her. All the pieces finally came together. Pat Taylor Allanson was a monster, much worse than people first thought. She was released from prison in 1999 after serving her full sentence. She went to live with the colonel and his new wife. Marguerite Boppo Radcliffe died from lung cancer a few years after Pat went to prison the second time. Colonel Clifford Radcliffe, love of her life, married Marguerite's sister Aggie just a few months later. Then Pat opened a doll shop she named Pat's Pretty Playthings. After his parole, Tom married a childhood friend named Liz. He became a born-again Christian, which helped him come to terms with killing his parents, and he was able to forgive. He did wind up reuniting with his children, but only after they were grown. Tom has praised Ann Rule's book for its accuracy. It helped him see things more clearly. He told the Atlanta Constitution, quote, all I wanted to do was make her happy, and it got to the point where nothing would make her happy. It took me a while to get my eyes open. I did a lot of stupid things, but that was because I was so blindly in love. In March of 2008, 70-year-old Patricia Radcliffe Taylor was charged with 3 felony counts of unauthorized distribution of controlled substances. She had doctor shopped around for hydrocodone, and in 1 year had obtained 3,700 pills. The sheriff's office said normally they would have investigated someone with that many pills for distribution, but it did appear she was only using them for herself. And it didn't look like the doctors did anything wrong, quote, other than to be taken in by what appeared to be a sweet little old lady. So the charges were dropped. And that brings me to a quote from Pat's daughter, Susan. She told American Justice that the thing you take away from this case is that you, quote, don't have to look bad to be bad. Pat looked and acted like a Southern belle, but she wasn't one at all. Susan said, crazy is not what she is. I feel like she's just cold, very cold, calculating. Pat Taylor Allanson was certainly no victim, but she was the product of generational lies, secrets that vined through her family like kudzu, grasping tighter through each matriarch after Mama Seiler. Marguerite Seiler Radcliffe was brought up in an oppressive home that, if anything, pushed her into her sexuality faster. She had 2 children out of wedlock, something that could stain a woman for life. So she carried on as if she had her children with her first husband before Colonel Radcliffe claimed them all as his own. But Pat seemed to sense her shame. She knew she was illegitimate. That's probably why Marguerite overcompensated with her only daughter. Whatever Pat wanted, Marguerite would find a way to get it for her. Her guilt of losing those first 5 years with little Patty caused her to spoil her beyond all reason, giving the grown Pat an unbridled sense of entitlement. She may have gotten pregnant at 15 and stuck in a loveless marriage, but she clung to her parents, never trying to create a real family of her own with her husband, never creating true bonds with her daughters, though she did seem to spoil her son Ronnie. All those years with Gil, she waited, biding her time for her real Rhett Butler, a man who would give her the Tara of her dreams, a man who would legitimize her into the proper lady she just knew she was. When she realized her mistake with Tom, that he would never repair the relationship with his father, she did not want to leave him. She wanted revenge. How dare Walter Allanson judge her? Her schemes for money kept failing, and her methods became more insidious. She seemed to feel nothing for all of the people she poisoned, even her own daughter. That's why, after all Pat's time in prison, she preferred her dolls. She could dress them in frilly clothes and fix their hair, and they never talked back. She still loved the Chantilly lace of her youth, dressing up as Scarlett with ruffles and lace adorning her lovely figure. She saw herself in those beautiful dolls. Not the ugly, aging, hateful woman she had become. She probably killed James Christ, and she almost killed Betty Christ, and she had separated the loving couple during James's final days. Betty was certain she lost years with her husband, and was incredibly sad that she wasn't there when he died. And this was after Pat had already been jailed for poisoning Pa and Nona Allanson, who, while they did survive, suffered greatly, horrific pain. And she certainly shortened their lives as well. And she was responsible for Walter and Carolyn's deaths. She orchestrated the whole shootout between Tom and his parents. She wrought the utter destruction of the Allanson family. But she was never, ever sorry. Southern Fried True Crime is hosted and produced by me, Erica Kelley. Today's episode was written and researched by myself and Haley Gray, with additional research by Anna Luria. Southern Fried's original music is by Rob Harrison of Gamma Radio, and the original graphic art is by Coley Horner. A special thank you to all of my listeners, especially those of you who have been through it with me for the long haul. I am so excited to hit this 150th milestone, and I am grateful and humbled to everyone who supports me. I plan to keep growing and learning and vow to uphold my Southern Fried standards of always respecting the victims in these stories first. Thanks again, y'all. And to my friends who will get this, I am sorry I could not find a way to get Bootylicious into the script. It's just too gross next to ass abscess. If you have any case suggestions, please visit my website, southernfriedtruecrime.com, and go to the listener suggestion tab. If you have submitted a case suggestion in the last few months, please resubmit it on the website. This is the best way for me to get those little-known cases y'all always send me. Please remember that I do not accept suggestions on social media private messages. With 3 platforms to manage, that is very overwhelming for me. I hope you understand. But please come join our Facebook group, Southern Fried True Crime Fans Discussion Group, where we swap recipes, worship Dolly Parton, and share memes. I much prefer spending my social media time in our lovely group. We do, of course, discuss true crime, not just Southern Fried, but all kinds, but it is still very much a Southern lifestyle group. Our group is a safe and fun corner of Facebook, and by God, we mean it when we say no shit asses allowed. It's not just a motto, it's how we run the group. If you enjoyed today's show, please don't forget to subscribe, and please tell a friend or rate and review on iTunes. I'm also on all large platforms like iHeart, Stitcher, and Spotify. Until next time, thanks so much for listening. Y'all take care.